This episode of This Agile Life has been brought to you by BrilliantAgile.com, providing Agile and Scrum training, consultancy, and personnel.
BrilliantAgile.com. Done right, it's brilliant.
Recorded on Tuesday, April 30th, 2013, in St. Louis, Missouri, This Agile Life, Episode 15. Don't be negative. Welcome to This Agile Life, a podcast about what it's like to be agile in the real world. Joining me today are my co-hosts, Craig Buchek.
Hello.
Hey, Craig, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good today. There's a baseball game going on outside.
Right across the way from us, baseball heaven, Busch Stadium, St. Louis Cardinals. Are you a big Cardinals fan?
And none of us are wearing Cardinal shirts today.
I grew up as a Cardinals fan. A little less time to go to games recently.
I understand. And Craig, you've been with us before, so people know a little bit about you, right?
Yep.
Okay. And one of our always hosts, or seems to be always lately, Amos King. How's it going, Amos?
Hey, John. Hey, Craig. Love you guys. Down here in beautiful St. James, not having any windows or having the wonderful view of the stadium that you guys have. And John, I have actually updated my blog and had 2 blog posts since last time we recorded.
I'm very impressed with you, Amos. I'll give you some time at the end of the podcast to plug it. Are you drinking coffee?
Yes, sir, I am.
Oh, he's going to be completely wired up.
I'm calorie
Craig.
counting now, so I'm drinking water, coffee. I do have a soda sitting here too, but I'm trying to stay away from anything with calories and limiting my soda intake.
Good luck with that.
Amos plus caffeine is going to be very hyper.
Yeah. We need to try extra hard to keep him under control tonight. But let's see the topic that we have tonight from our Ready Queue, and it's behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development. So I think we've all used
Does
some
this mean
form
we have to have accepted behavior tonight?
that we have to have prescriptive behavior. Oh, wait, there's no Jason Tice is not here, so
Tice is in here.
we don't need any prescriptive behavior. But I think each of us has done some sort of behavior-driven development or acceptance test-driven development before. So for our listening audience, we should go ahead and define what we mean by behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development. Do either of you fine gentlemen want to take a crack at that?
I'll start
I'm
with.
going to let you do it, Craig, so nobody can argue with me.
I'll start with acceptance test-driven development because it's easier to define. So acceptance test-driven development, you start with acceptance tests, and you use those to define when you're done with a particular scenario or story. So an acceptance test means that the customer defines the test, and you basically write the code behind that test and make sure that it fits what the customer is asking for. Behavior-driven development, I've seen 2 different ways of expressing it. One is just a different way of looking at test-driven development, TDD, just thinking about behaviors instead of tests. And the other definition I've seen is an outside-in way of testing, where you start with the acceptance test and then work your way down to a unit test.
So what's the difference between a behavior and a test?
Well, I mean, a behavior is different than a test, but you want to test that behavior. The real difference seems to be the focus. So don't think of them as tests. Think of them as specifying behaviors. And since you don't think of them as tests as much, you don't have to. I guess you don't have to. The testing mentality is different than a specification mentality, I think.
So, Amos, are you happy with that analysis?
Somewhat. The hard part, I think, for explaining it is the difference between specifying behavior and testing. And I don't know that I can do any better of a job of explaining it than Craig did.
So there's a canonical description of BDD It's called Introducing BDD. It's by Dan North. It's on dannorth.net. We'll put that in the show notes. And it talks about some of the aha moments he had in coming up with this. Him and some other folks came up with this. And a few things that he found help steer tests towards behavioral specifications. So we can go over each of those if you guys want.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add is, in my experience, the difference in the way I've used behavior-driven development versus test-driven development is that the behavior-driven development is kind of at a higher level and usually focuses from the outside in. Like you mentioned, Craig, I thought that was an excellent description, is the concept of it being an outside-in sort of a thing where you don't really have knowledge of or in-depth experience with what's inside what you're testing. You're just saying, these are the things that I want the system to do and how I think the system will behave when I do these things. And I'm defining them, codifying them in something that can be executed in an automated fashion. And it's not even really important that it be described as a test per se, but I think in the end, we often end up using that description of the behavior to help verify that we've implemented things appropriately, and therefore we end up also calling it a test as well.
So I agree. That's why I said
a big difference that I see between a behavior and a test is that if I'm testing a method, I will try to sit and think in my head, how many different ways can I come into this method and where can it come out, instead of looking at the object as a whole, where when I look at a behavior test, I may only deal with that method within one state of that object and never have to worry about it in any other state. But I know that these other states are not possible, but when I'm thinking at that fine-grained test level versus behavior level, when I'm at that test level, I think of all kinds of inputs that never really happen throughout my system, where the behavior keeps me at a little higher altitude.
So in some ways I disagree, because the principles in this document introducing BDD, I use at those lower level unit tests as well. I don't just use them in the acceptance test.
I use them in unit tests too. I'm saying keeping me at the higher level. I don't mean an acceptance test where you're driving your system from the top down. Even at a unit level, let's say I have a user class and it has, I don't know, I can't think of a good example right now, but I might be testing just that class. But the position at which I approach from a behavior level is, how does this user behave, not how do the inputs affect the outputs of this single method. So I'm looking at the user object as a whole in its current state, and what are the actions or reactions that class has to me passing it certain messages.
So in a way, it's a different way of viewing how you write your test and what your tests mean and what they're used for, right?
Yes. And it changes what I test because of the change in thought process of where I come from.
Because you're thinking more about the users than the code. I think
more about the behavior.
Right. And when I do test level, I think about just what does this little tiny block of code do, and I test it in all kinds of ways that maybe my user class would never actually end up in. So I write a bunch of extra code too, usually when I go a TDD versus BDD route.
Is there really a big enough difference between acceptance test-driven development and behavior-driven development that they need to be separate things? Can we just lump them into the same category?
Yeah, because as Amos and I were talking about, we do BDD at those lower levels. An acceptance test is a higher level. So the acceptance tests are user-facing. These are the things that the users see, whereas we can do BDD at the unit test level, where that's more at the code level, where the user of our product won't actually see those classes that we're testing in those levels.
Right, but just because you can do it at the lower level, does that mean that you're not doing it at the higher level?
No.
And that just because you're using BDD
I would
principles,
say acceptance tests are a form of behavior-driven development, but that doesn't mean that behavior-driven development is acceptance tests. Like I don't know, a square is a parallelogram, but a parallelogram is not necessarily a square. This lag is really messing with me too.
well, I think we can agree that they're relatively close, but there's differences among them, and then there's differences between behavior-driven development, ATDD, and TDD. So what are some of the benefits to using a behavior-driven approach or an acceptance test-driven development approach? What have you guys witnessed? What have been the benefits that you've seen on the projects that you've been on?
The acceptance tests define done for me on a feature, especially if you can keep them small enough. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes. But at that level, it's good for communicating to other people what the overall system should do, and it helps me focus in on a tiny portion or a tiny feature in order to quickly give benefit out to a customer.
And what is the thing, Amos, that you're defining done for? Is it a story in your case? Is it a feature? Where do you usually make the correlation between an acceptance or a behavior-driven development test and a thing that you're implementing?
I try to do it at a story level. I would say for every acceptance test, that is a story. Now, you may go to implement story, add in the acceptance test, and everything already works because of a previous story, which great, but to me, that's a story level issue. And if you have an acceptance test, hopefully you can just go ahead and deploy that out to production and it be a very tiny feature, maybe part of a larger feature set.
So, Craig, the same question for you. What do you see the benefits are in your experience and in your development?
So I agree with Amos that the acceptance tests tell me when I'm done. So usually I organize one feature per file and may have multiple stories per feature in that file. And so I'll work on one story at a time. We usually use stories on our Kanban. That's pretty typical of Agile. So the way we typically work is we take that story, we write the test for that, we get a failing test, and then we go down to the lower levels and we figure out the code that's going to be needed for that, and we write the unit tests. And then we get the unit test passing, and then we go back to the acceptance test and see if that's working yet, and then kind of just iterate through those different levels. At the unit testing level, I find BDD gives me some benefits there, mainly focus. So, telling when we're done is a way to focus, but we can also focus at the lower level. Like Amos was saying, you can focus on only the pieces that you need for your application. You don't have to worry about all kinds of different inputs that may not matter to you. So you can just say, in this case, this needs to happen. In this case, this needs to happen. Not worry about the cases that you don't need for your application. Also, the expressiveness, we use different terms. We use sentences in BDD. That's something that BDD taught us, was to name your tests in sentences. Things like RSpec, you can actually just use a string instead of a long method or function name. So I get a lot out of it at different levels.
So I agree. The definition of done is a big one. I also think having a repeatable and automated set of acceptance tests is another great benefit to doing BDD or to doing acceptance test driven development. And if you have those running on an automation rig somewhere, a continuous integration rig somewhere, it's great to be able to check code in after you've done your BDD and TDD work, and then watch the integration rig run the whole suite of tests and verify what you hopefully already knew, that your stuff was working as expected and you haven't broken anything else. So I like that it gives you another layer of testing that is more acceptance test focused, more customer focused, kind of seen through the eyes of the customer, written in a very digestible way in sentence form and natural language form, rather than being something highly technical that maybe only developers can easily understand. Yes,
the way I write acceptance tests.
I like that whenever you're using the sentences, it also helps you kind of, I guess I would say, single responsibility principle applied to a test. If you start noticing that when you're writing those sentences, you're saying and adding behaviors, maybe that's a different story and a completely different test. And so it helps me split out things into smaller groups too.
So the acceptance test we typically write in Cucumber, which lets us write English stories that make sense to the customer. So you can actually show your customer. I've actually had instances where we had a customer involved in writing them, and then we kind of translated that into code underneath. But having something that the customer can understand is very valuable. So there's less disagreement or less possible disagreement on if you've done what they've asked you to. You can use those acceptance tests as that agreement on what you're going to do. We use a tool called Cucumber, and it uses a structure that's introduced in this BDD article. It's called given, when, then structure. So given are the things that set up the context for what you're going to test. The when is the actions that you're going to perform, and the thens are what the results you expect to see. And so that's typical for acceptance tests. I've actually seen them used in unit tests as well, the given, when, then. And it's a different way of thinking of the pieces of the test and the context and what you need to happen. And those map fairly well to other unit test names for those things. You've got setup, action, and teardown, or what is it? AAA.
Assemble, act, assert.
Right.
So those things all kind of fit together in terms of it's a common paradigm for set up some data, take some actions, observe the results of the actions, and then measure if they succeeded or not.
And I think the difference is that the given, when, and then are more customer understandable, where, act and assert are not necessarily things the customer is going to understand.
I would caution you on the customer understandable point that you need to keep them at a really high level. Like, I've seen a lot of people using Cucumber to test their websites, and they say, I go to this form and I fill in name with Amos, and I fill in email with amos@example.com, and I fill in age with this, and they fill in a bunch of stuff. Well, you lose the purpose of your test whenever you get to that fine grain of a detail, and that behavior or that acceptance test is now only usable if you're using a web client. If you do a different interface, it may not work for you anymore. So your tests are not reusable, and it's hard to show the customer and then realize what's going on. So I like to wrap a lot of that up to say, I go to the registration form, I fill out the form correctly, and then I receive a confirmation.
Amos, I think that's one of the things that people have the toughest time with when they're getting started with BDD or ATDD is that they tend to err on the side of going toward a smaller granularity for their steps and for their assertions in their Cucumber tests or in their RSpec tests or whatever it is they're doing. And that was something that you pointed out to me at least a year ago when you and I were when I first discussed with you some of this stuff. And it took me a little while to even come around to that point of view as well. But in addition to making it more readable for the end user or for the customer, it also makes the test less brittle, so that if things change, if requirements change in terms of what's required on a form, you don't have to necessarily change the language of the test. You just have to change some of the underlying
stuff.
stuff.
If the goal of that scenario doesn't change because you removed a field from your form, then you should that should be a background, something abstracted away within the scenario itself.
Plus, if they're shorter, the customer is going to read them more.
Right,
the customers
and they're
will
more
get
likely
bored.
to write them back to you. That's a good way to get your customer to write them, actually, too, is if your customer gives you a requirement, write one and send it to them. Ask them if that's what they mean. You do that enough times, and they will start to hand them to you in that format already.
Right. But I found value in them even without having the customer even looking at them.
Yeah,
just
sure.
for the seeing if I'm done, knowing when I'm
Absolutely.
done aspect.
I agree, and I think the syntax is very approachable. I mean, anybody can sit down quickly and understand the syntax and get started with it. And I think it does make a great vehicle for communication amongst teams and across teams, spanning out into the customer base. I think it's just a very approachable way for people to communicate about the behavior and define done.
Even when you're working alone, I would like people to realize that your tests communicate with you, so you can communicate with your future self.
Yep, good point, Amos. So another question I wanted to pose to you guys is, do you have to use a tool to do behavior-driven development? We've talked about tools already. We've mentioned, or at least we've alluded to them. Craig, you mentioned Cucumber, and I think I brought up RSpec, and I don't know if we dropped any other names while we were going through this, but is it a necessary part of doing BDD and ATDD to use a tool?
I would say not necessarily, but I think you'd have a hard time without some of those tools. To me, the important part is the outside-in testing, the knowing when I'm done, and the behavior specification mentality versus the test mentality. Those are the important parts. You could do them without a tool, just using asserts, but the tools definitely make it easier. They help you get it.
Well, just take automation out of it completely and just using the language. Is there value in just using the language to document acceptance criteria and stories and to help define done for your stories and ultimately for your features?
Yeah, and the whole knowing when I'm done is helpful. Even if I don't have automated test, I can actually just walk through and make sure that use it as a checklist if you need to.
Yeah, even if you can get QA personnel to look at things or to write them with you, then give that to them as like a script to follow. As long as you're not fine-grained, you also get to find out about, is your interface intuitive enough, and things like that. Just by them looking through those steps, can they complete it?
So yeah, I've actually done that. Probably my most success with BDD and acceptance test is having the QA person on our team write the Cucumber tests, and a few of them ended up being manual. Things like, is this the right font? That's really hard for a computer to do.
Sure.
You could do it, but we would have spent a month figuring out how to check pixels and make sure they're the right font and everything. So we actually made some tests. We tagged them as manual, and they didn't run in the automated testing, but the QA person ran through those, and they could run through the automated tests as well manually and make sure that they were still valid and still made sense when they did manually.
Yeah, so some of the teams that I've been coaching lately, I've suggested to them, even if they never get as far as to implement BDD and ATDD on their teams, to at least use the given, when, then, the Gherkin syntax to document their acceptance criteria, because there's value in the structure, and the structure helps people easily digest and decompose what the acceptance criteria is. So my coaching to teams at this point has been, go ahead and use the Gherkin syntax for your acceptance criteria as a way to get started. And then as you go and start automating more of your acceptance tests, more of your, or your acceptance tests at all, you can leverage some available tool sets to do that.
And use that Gherkin syntax to leverage where to split out stories too, because if you follow it, you'll find out that, hey, I've written 5 different of these given when thens for one story. Maybe we can split it into 5 different stories then. I found that that's a good way to keep from having really long meetings where people are trying to decide where stories should be split and things like that. Is if you have those, you just split them. Those are the stories done.
Cool. Well, so we obviously would like to use tools. They help us be more efficient. They help us do things like wire into continuous integration rigs, etc. So, Amos, what tools do you have experience with, and do you recommend to folks that you work with for doing BDD and ATDD?
I use Cucumber and RSpec. I've used Sauce Labs, or I think it's Sauce Labs. It might just be called Sauce, which
I think you're on the
allows
Sauce.
you to run across multiple browsers. I do mostly web development, and I helped actually get Cucumber running an Eclipse RCP app too. So you don't just have to use Cucumber with the web. And if you are, I would suggest Capybara WebKit to a lot of people. You can run it in the background. That way it doesn't pop up a browser in front of you. And I utilize Guard to run the tests automatically every time I save a file too. So it's nice to be able to run your integration test without a browser popping up in your face, and you just continue working and saving. So, I mean, those are the tools that I see is RSpec and Cucumber. And then if you're doing Java, JBehave is pretty good.
Which was the Java one?
JBehave.
Oh, JBehave. And what about Capybara? Is that the thing that enables the headless running of your tests?
Capybara WebKit does. Capybara itself is a DSL for running browsers, and you can plug Selenium or Chrome driver or all kinds of stuff into the backend to run different browsers.
All right, Craig. What about you? Same question.
So I'm also a Ruby developer, so most of the same things Amos talked about are common things I've used. Cucumber, RSpec, Capybara. Real big fan of Capybara. I've also done a little bit of Java on a project where I used Cucumber JVM. It's only about 1.5 years old. It had some issues a year ago, but it was getting better. Every week or so we got some improvements. So we had that hooked into Selenium 2, also known as WebDriver. It was also fairly new. It didn't even have a Chrome backend at the time. But I know that's been rectified at this point. We looked at JBehave, but I was more familiar with Cucumber. Cucumber JVM is written by the same guys that wrote Cucumber, and it had a lot of active development going on. So I tried that first, and it worked for us. So that's what we used. I think that's about it.
There used to be a Cuke for Duke, but I think that maybe has kind of fallen off the map.
Cucumber JVM replaced that, and it's
okay.
Most of the same people.
I see. So the folks...
I will say that right now I'm working on a project where I have multiple browsers that interact with each other, and testing by hand sucks when you have to bounce back and forth between 2 browsers. And Cucumber and Capybara have kind of saved my sanity with that.
That's good to hear, because that's something that's always in jeopardy with you. So on the Java teams that I've worked with, we started off with regular Cucumber, Ruby Cucumber, and wrote it and ran the Cucumber tests in JRuby, or I guess ran it on top of JRuby, which seemed to work fairly well. I guess some of the complaints that we got was that, well, now I have to understand Ruby to write my implement my Cucumber steps.
It's not a terrible thing to know Ruby.
Right. So, however, it can be sometimes a little bit of a stretch for people. And so Lee actually, when Lee and I were working together, he started to use Cucumber JVM, and that seems to be a more natural way to ease Java developers into BDD, is to allow them to use Java language to implement their steps for
right.
Cucumber.
My project was hard enough. We were, they were not that experienced at Java. Even, they weren't very experienced developers. They didn't know anything about Agile. We were teaching them Agile at the same time. And, we're teaching them Cucumber. I figured we didn't need to throw another language in at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, if it depends on the level of the developers, whether you need to throw in another language at them.
Without getting into too much of a language, religion sort of war, I just found that it was a lot more clear. It was easier to write Cucumber tests with Ruby, but that's just me. I don't want to start any wars.
I think Amos and I would say it's easier to write almost anything in Ruby.
Yeah. And I'm
the whole, what do they call it? I can't think of what it's called in Java, where you have the @ symbol over top of a method.
The
is a lot
annotating.
of how you get your Cucumber steps into into run your Java code. So I think that kind of thing gets to be kind of more magical than the regular expressions that Ruby's using.
Yeah, I guess the more times I have to do something, because I've been doing a lot of scripting languages, JavaScript, Ruby stuff, Python lately. Every time I have to go back to the JDK and the JVM, it feels so heavyweight to me. I just kind of wince when I have to do that. But
high ceremony. There's a lot of ceremony you have to do to get anything done.
Yeah, and
Eclipse the cathedral,
along with the strong typing that's going on there as well.
Oh, I'm not against strong typing. I'm just against having to type the word map 3 times in the same line.
All right. End of the
All right.
language war before it goes full on. So I think we covered the tools. One of the things, Amos, I wanted to ask you, because I don't know if you and Craig have the same workflow, but what kind of a workflow do you espouse or suggest to people that are starting with BDD? Is it the same sort of one that Craig mentioned before? Where he was saying he started
I
with
work outside in, top down, whatever you want to call it. I write given when then, and then I try to run everything. The first thing will fail, like the first step, it will be the given that fails. So I implement the given step in the background, run it again, let that step fail or pass, move on to the next one, and I implement the steps one at a time through my given when and then, and till I get to a point that I now need to start implementing stuff outside of the steps, and then I start top-down behavior-driven development on the unit level.
So you automate as much as you can at first, do your development?
Yeah, I start automating immediately because I don't want to have to run that. And like I said earlier, I even use guard so that I don't have to think to run it. Every time I save a file, it runs, and I use tmux, and it changes my bar to green, red, or yellow, depending on whether something is passing, failing, or pending.
It helps that we're working in environments where these things are already set up for us, where, Cucumber and Rails is a known quantity. It's easy to get started always having the test there. Whereas if you're doing some, I don't know if iOS or Android or PhoneGap or whatever would have those types of testing environments built in for you to get started. But if you're doing Rails, it's really easy to get started now. And the community actually encourages it and not only encourages it, assumes you're going to do it that way.
I get that. I definitely get that from the Ruby and the Rails community, that it's kind of a given that you should be doing those things, or else you're not following normal form. And it is more of a headache for from other languages, other technologies to get started with it. But I definitely feel like it's ultimately worth the effort that you put into it. And it's a good consulting opportunity. I've got a client right now that I'm working with to try and help them get up and running with a BDD framework. But Amos, the last thing I wanted to ask you in that regard, in the regard of your process and your process flow, is the automation side of it. So a lot of people, I think, struggle with, well, I can't automate everything up front, and then they slack off or forget to do the automation at the end. What can we suggest to people to help them make sure that they're getting their automation in?
I actually think it's easier to automate from the beginning when you only have one thing to deal with. Anytime that I've ever put it off on a project, it ends up taking much more time later in order to get everything set up. If you can can do just one test, just do one simple test. I don't care or scenario. Sorry, not test. We're talking about behavior now. Just do one and get that working immediately. It'll save you a lot of pain in the long run, and you don't have to worry about whenever you're working with Craig and he checks in stuff that's broke, you don't know about it.
That never happens, right, Craig? What do you think?
That's why you have a continuous integration server, right?
Yeah, you just have to have one that looks for comments.
Oh, there we go.
That can be handled.
So, what was the question again?
Around automation, I think sometimes developers rush to done without coming back and completing their automation.
That's pretty much the whole TDD argument. Why do we do TDD? It's because we found that it works better. So when you're doing acceptance test, usually your first test is basically to see if the testing framework works. And I guess it's pretty typical of TDD. Maybe we just trust that a little more to work. So your first test should basically be, I can see the home page or whatever, or the home screen, whatever type of application you're doing. Just to make sure all your pieces are there, and then you can get your continuous integration set up. I think that, getting started is a worthwhile effort, as you said. And it'll take some effort. Hopefully you've already got something that's built for you that you don't have to spend, days or weeks to get going. If you can spend 1 or 2 days on a project that's, a couple months, it's definitely worth it.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Your tests aren't doing you any good if they're not being run.
Absolutely. So here's a bit of a trolling question for you guys, and I've already tipped you off to the fact that this is kind of trolling, but I didn't want people to think I was coming off arrogant or presupposing this, but doesn't this now mean that we don't need testers and we don't need quality assurance people on teams? They're waste anyway, right?
No, you're not going to be able to test everything automated, and you also miss some things. Even when you're using like Cucumber, you miss some things that are visual that you can't really test without looking at it. And your high-level integration tests take so long to run usually that you don't want to have a huge amount of them. So, and you're also not going to test every little possibility. Like, what happens if I put an integer in this field that's supposed to have only alpha characters? So you still need those people to come in and try to bang away and do things that you as a developer didn't even think of.
Come on, Craig. Amos is crazy. Back me up. QA's dead.
So QA can do exploratory testing.
You don't troll very well.
Damn.
So exploratory testing is basically just clicking on things and trying to break things. I saw a quote a couple weeks ago, and it said something that to the effect that bugs are really just specifications that we forgot to write. So they should be involved in helping you write those. The project where I found the best use of Cucumber and acceptance test was we had the QA person writing the test for us. And so he got pretty good at that after, a few weeks, couple months. But he was also doing exploratory testing and finding new tests that had to be written.
Yeah, so in reality, I guess unfortunately, it'd be nice to be able to knock off another role on the team, devote to development. But we do need QA testers. We need user acceptance testers and people to fill in the gaps that straight up developers can't always anticipate all of the things. You guys mentioned exploratory testing, negative testing. I mean, there's the just banging on the system sort of testing that has to happen, and there's still a lot of value that the QA team and QA folks bring to the table. And Craig, you mentioned a really good one, and that's collaborating with them to help look at and define a broader range of acceptance criteria, and bringing them into the fold and having them help write Cucumber tests and even helping automate them and really taking that whole team approach of everybody's responsible for the quality of the code, getting everyone engaged, even as far as to bringing in, if you have business analysts, having business analysts get engaged to help define cucumber tests or define given when then scenarios and passing those off so that there's just this common nomenclature of what is done, what is acceptance mean, what does verification of a story mean, that can be easily shared across a team and across a group of people all working towards the same goal of high quality software. Okay, so
and negative tests are dumb.
Negative tests are dumb? You don't like them?
Yeah, you said negative tests. Negative tests are really bad. I can check for a web page and say that Craig is not found on the web page with a capital C, but the guy implements it and puts in Craig with all caps. And so I said Craig wasn't supposed to be on the web page, but it still is. I could also test that the entire contents of War and Peace is not on the web page. Great. What benefit did that give to you?
Okay.
Without a positive test, the negative test is pretty worthless, and they're very, very brittle.
So I see. I misspoke because what I really meant was alternate case scenarios or non-happy path scenarios, and what I said was negative testing. So I misspoke there, Amos. I agree with what you're saying, though, around negative testing. That's a good point. So what suggestions, guys, can we share with our audience to help them avoid, things that we ran into when we were getting started with BDD and ATDD? You have any ideas?
We already talked about the one where when you're writing your acceptance test, being too detailed. Definitely speaking high level, sort of speaking the value to the customer language. So that the value is seen there, not so much the details of how to get that value.
And remember that you might be targeting your customer, not necessarily your end user with a test. So you might not speak in I as an end user. You might speak in when a user does this, we show them some marketing messages or something like that, some upsell. So yeah, speak in the value that you're trying to get at.
Actually, that brings up another point that we didn't cover was another way of expressing things that your features. Generally, we have a format for that too, and it's as a specific type of user, I want something so that I get some sort of value. So it's as I want so that. So that's another way of framing things so that you're focused, making sure that you're focused on a value for a specific person.
Yeah, I've used that language in my cucumber tests, Craig. I usually use that as kind of it's the feature statement.
Right.
So as some role, some user of the system, I want to be able to do something in the system so that I extract some business value from the system, right? And that's a good way to kind of give a synopsis of the value and the activity that's going to occur for the feature.
Right. Another pitfall that I've run into is brittleness of acceptance tests, especially when we're doing Cucumber and Selenium or WebDriver. I don't know that I have a lot of good answers for that. Amos, do you have some good answers for those?
I tried to. Well, you were the one that told me originally about page objects, and I have also started to do role, like a user role object. So, like in the one that I'm talking about earlier about how I have two browsers interacting, I actually created two objects, a host object and a guest object that wrap up what it is to do certain things as the host and as the guest. And it allows me to make sure that I dry up my tests. And even if it is a little brittle, if I have to change something, I only have to change it in one spot and not a bunch of them. And that has helped me a lot. Role objects and page objects are good.
So were you creating kind of an abstraction layer over the user interface that you were working through there or not?
Yeah, so in at the test level, or at the implementation of the step level, I would actually say host dot start session,
and have all of what it is to start a session wrapped up in there, as well as I am in 2 different browsers, so I had to switch back and forth from the browsers, so all that is wrapped up inside of the host object to know which browser it should talk to, so I'm not doing that everywhere. And if I change the way that I have to pick which browser to talk to, I only have to change it inside of that host, not everywhere else.
So the page object is that abstraction wrapper around your interactions with a particular page in a website or in another type of application.
Yep. And a role object is just a role interacting with that website if you need it. That sometimes happens. The nice thing about that is I also make steps reusable at that point, because if I have an admin user and a regular user and I just have to use polymorphism and implement the same, make it handle the same messages of maybe sign in. So I would have user.signin, and it could be an admin user or a regular user, and I don't care. I can reuse that same step.
How important do you guys feel like it is to refactor and reuse steps like that?
I would say not as important as refactoring in your code. I think at the page object level, actually, it's useful. That's kind of the layer that you can do that refactoring. In your step definitions, if you're using Cucumber, I don't find it all that useful. Sometimes you'll have a lot of steps that are similar, but not really worth merging into a single thing. I do find that if you've got some constants or something that you do want to keep those in one place, like if you're wanting to test what happens when you do, when pagination kicks in. So if pagination kicks in at 10 items, you definitely want to test 12 items, or 9, 10, 11, 12 items, testing your boundary conditions there.
And I kind of disagree with Craig here, because I feel like tests are code too, and when I've gone about making them well factored, it makes my life much simpler in the long run in order to change some of that behavior at some point. It minimizes the amount of work I have to do to make a change across my entire test suite.
I think you have to be careful, and you don't want to get into a gold plating situation where you're spending a bunch of time refactoring and refining and improving your tests. But
you have that same problem in your regular code too.
I think there's a line.
We can strive for perfection, but sometimes you just have to deliver, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's a line, and I think that line is different for test code than it is for production code.
I agree.
All right, why don't we? Understood. We've talked a lot about
arguing about that.
We've talked a lot about BDD and ATDD. We've included a link in the show notes to the article from Dan North that we reference introducing BDD. BDD. One too many D's there. So check that out, and let's do our picks for the show. So Craig, why don't you start us off with your picks tonight, mister?
My first pick is Reveal.js, Reveal. It's a JavaScript slideshow library. Really neat slideshow tool. It lets you navigate. It's got some nice graphics effects built in. Pretty simple just to add that to your basically just HTML. He also has a companion thing called rvl.io where you can compose those slideshows. And my second pick is Backend as a Service. So I ran into this a company called Parse, P-A-R-S-E, a year or two ago. And if you're writing a mobile app, they'll sort of do the backend for you. You just need to describe it. You don't have to write it. So very handy. I haven't used it myself, actually. I've had a friend use it, and he gave it high raves. And so I'm looking at I actually had an interview with a company called Kii, K-I-I, which does something similarly. And and they're doing backend as a service. So they've got basically your RESTful APIs, and they're also helping you do monetization. So helping you do metrics and ads and figuring out how you can improve your income on your mobile app.
That's cool. We talked about Parse on our companion podcast, iOS, a number of times, and it seems like a very useful backend as a service offering. And they really go the extra mile to entice you in. You know, they give you kind of out of the box functionality. They give you tutorials and jumpstart projects to get going with. So it's an interesting offering, an interesting paradigm out there in the mobile space. I'm going to do my pick next. I did a webcast about a year ago, on maybe less, on Cucumber called The Secret Sauce, and I'll put the link in the show notes where you can find my webcast on Cucumber. Amos, you have a veritable truckload of picks, so let's go over to Amos and get his picks.
I'm going to minimize them. So I will throw out Guard. I think that it is really great for automating a lot of stuff whenever you're working on your local box. Guard watches the file system for changes and reacts to events. There's a bunch of plugins for it. You can write shell scripts for it. I use it to restart servers whenever configuration files and things change that force the server to need to be restarted, so I don't have to restart a local running server. I have it watch all of my test directories and my application directories and rerun tests, and even my acceptance level tests, and run those with Capybara WebKit in the background. My next pick is pairprogramwith.me. It is a website, I believe it was originally put up there by Avdi Grimm. There's a button out there that you can put on your own website, which I've included on mine, that you have it notify you that someone wants to pair with you, and you can schedule time up with them. I do that over Tmux and Vim a lot, and it's got a lot of good resources on there for if you're wanting to do some remote pair programming with people. And then my last pick is getting away from programming, but still technology related, is MyFitnessPal, myfitnesspal.com. They have a phone application as well as a web application, and I've been tracking calories and working out, and it tracks all that for me, and tracks my weight and tells me how much I'm going to weigh by a certain date if I continue along my current path. And the phone app actually just allows me to scan food barcodes, and then I can just tell it how many grams or ounces or serving sizes that I've eaten, and it keeps track of all that for me. It's really nice, and it keeps me motivated whenever I see that I'm running out of calories for the day or I haven't gone and worked out.
And it lets you send friends messages and whatnot. I'm on that too, Amos, so I'll have to friend you on MyFitnessPal. And
Woo, we should be friends.
Totally. Well, good picks, guys, and that's all we have.
You're cutting out on me.
Sorry, we're at the end here, Amos. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my co-hosts for joining me. Craig Buchek, why don't you tell everyone where they can find out more about you?
I'm GitHub. I am BOOCH. On Twitter, I'm Craig Buchek, CraigBuchek. And I have restarted my blog, like Amos. It is blog.boochtech, BOOCHTEK.com.
We'll have those links in the show notes for everybody so they can find you more easily. Craig, Amos, dirty information appears to be updated. I'm quite impressed. So where else can people find Amos King at?
Besides dirtyinformation.com, I can be found on GitHub or Twitter at ADKRON. That's Adcron. And that's about it. If anybody is interested, I would love to pair on some open source work, and you can get a hold of me for that by going to my website and clicking on the Pair With Me button.
I just might do that. And I'm John Sextro.
I would love to, John.
Oh, absolutely. You guys can find more about me on johnsextro.com. You can follow me on Twitter at JC Sextro. And hey, check out our website for the show. You can find our show notes and links to all of the picks that we've mentioned. You can check out our website at thisagilelife.com. I'd like to thank a few more people, our engineer and audio engineer, the guy that does all of our post-production, Dr. Lee McCauley. Like to thank Rich Johnson for the intro music, Dan Schwabe for the outro music. Easy for me to say. And that's it, everybody. Thanks for listening to This Agile Life, and keep living this Agile life.
I'd like to add one more thing.
Nope.
When Tice isn't here, there's no cussing through the entire podcast.
How about that?
Just saying.